This story, called Blood Guilt, is set in Sutton Coldfield in England. That's the town where I grew up. And it's set in the 1940s. Jimmy Richards and Len Thomas had been friends ever since they met at the age of 5 at the primary school on Victoria Road. They lived close to each other. Jimmy lived on Park Road and Len lived on Upper Clifton Road. Both boys had siblings, but none were close in age. Jimmy's brother and sister were much older, and Len's only sister was 7 years younger. The two boys were largely inseparable, and as they grew up in the dark days of the 1930s, they spent much of their free time in the moderately tamed wilderness of Sutton Park, which they came to know in greater detail than most of the park foresters, as they were then known, who worked there. When they reached their 18th birthdays in 1943, Jimmy and Len were both called up for active military service. They both volunteered in the RAF, and they were assigned to Bomber Command. Len undertook training as a pilot. Jimmy, however, was found to be red-green colourblind, and that disqualified him from pilot's training, and so he trained to become a bomb aimer. They went their separate ways, and it was quite by chance that the two of them met up again at RAF Wychford in the winter of 1944, serving with 115 Squadron, which was flying Lancaster heavy bombers. It was also pure chance that Jimmy flew with Len on the bombing raid to Duisburg, Germany, on the night of May the 22nd, 1944. Lancaster had a crew of 7, of whom the bomb aimer also doubled as a forward gunner. This dual responsibility involved lying prone along an alleyway that led to the so-called Perspex bubble. From his position in the alleyway, the bomb aimer would press a button to release the bombs when the aircraft was above its target, besides communicating with the pilot for course corrections. The bomb aimer also doubled, as I mentioned, as a forward gunner, this time in a standing position when not in the vicinity of the target. On the night in question, Len's regular bomb aimer was down with the flu, and Jimmy volunteered to take his place as the bomb aimer. As the Lancaster reached the target area, it was picked up by enemy searchlights, and despite intense anti-aircraft fire from the ground, Len was able to maintain the level course that was required for the release of the bombs. Immediately the bombs had been released, the aircraft bucked upwards with its lightened load, and Jimmy assumed the gunnery position. As the Lancaster turned northwestwards, it was attacked from below by a Messerschmitt 109. Its fire immediately irretrievably damaged the landing gear. Jimmy found himself trapped in the forward gunnery compartment. The Lancaster had also received engine damage, and by the time it limped back across the North Sea to eastern England, Len had been forced to close down number 3 engine, and number 4 was operating at significantly less than full power. On the approach to Wychford, as Len attempted to lower the landing gear, there was no response. Not only was the hydraulic system inoperable, but also the manual backup operated by the crew members. A distress call went out to the tower, indicating that Piper Charlie was coming in disabled, with engines failing and no landing gear. It was the wireless operator who told Len, "Jimmy's stuck in the bomb aimer's slot. For Christ's sake, get him out of there, we're going to crash land. That's assuming we make it home at all." The rear gunner crawled down the bomb aimer's alley. It was blocked with twisted metal. "Can you hear me, Jimmy?" "Yeah." "Can you move?" "Not much, I can't crawl backwards. Something's blocking the way and I think my leg got hit. That's like buggery." The tower radioed to the stricken Lang. "Piper Charlie, can you hear me? Piper Charlie, can you hear me? Come in on the main runway. We'll have a fire crew ready for you. My bomb aim is trapped in the nose and the landing gear is stuck. I need to go round again. We have you visually. The smoke coming from 2 of your 4 engines now. Do not try to go round again. Come straight in. Not possible, it'll kill the bomb aimer. Come straight in. Repeat, Piper Charlie, come straight in. That is an order. A half-mile out, the runway was easily in sight in the early morning light. The engines hiccuped but caught again. There's a famous psychological problem that was first described in 1967, more than 2 decades after World War II had ended. A runaway trolley on a train track is bearing down on a group of people. They will all die if it runs into them. A switch can divert the trolley onto a parallel track, but unfortunately there's a single person in the way on that second track. The problem is, do you pull the switch? Dilemma concerns whether to do the greater good for the greater number, killing one to save the group, or to take an active part in killing one rather than passively letting the group perish. If Len were to fail to land the plane, it would undoubtedly crash, probably killing everybody aboard. If Len landed the plane on the runway, the collapsing front end of the plane would crush Jimmy. There was no time to debate the question. The runway was rearing up. The engines were hiccuping more violently. Len set the plane down on the runway amid a shower of sparks and screeching metal as the front of the plane disintegrated in a tangle of twisted metal and the propellers dug uselessly into the ground. The plane came to a halt. 5 crew members scrambled out, realizing how lucky they were to be alive. There was no sound from the area of the wrecked gunnery compartment. Knowing what he'd just done, Len stayed in the pilot's seat, strapped in, waiting for fire to consume the aircraft. But miraculously there was no fire. Ground crew called up, then they brought over a ladder, and eventually one of them climbed up and talked the nearly insensible Len out of the cockpit. He was unable to speak. They half-carried Len to the infirmary. He was clearly in deep shock. He neither spoke nor otherwise responded. After 2 days in an almost catatonic state, they made arrangements for him to be transferred to a rehabilitation centre in Cheshire. He remained there for 3 months, but even when he was declared fit to return to active service, he was completely unable to resume flying. He suffered flashbacks of the night when he caused the death of his best friend, and from severe nightmares, from which he would awake sweating and screaming. Today we call it post-traumatic stress disorder. Wing Commander Ray Dawkins wrote letters to the parents of the 2 young flyers. Margaret and Jack Richards were told only that Jimmy had died when his aircraft had crashed on its return from a bombing raid in Germany. Jimmy's remains, such as they were returned in a closed pine coffin. And Reverend John Boggin conducted his funeral service at Holy Trinity Church. Among the mourners were Len's parents, Maud and Peter, who awkwardly expressed their sorrow to Jimmy's grieving parents. They alone knew that Len had been piloting the plane on that fateful night. As to Len's absence from his friend's funeral, the ready and truthful answer was that Len was presently in hospital, but they had no further information. Margaret and Jack perhaps might have expected to receive a visit, or at least a letter of condolence from Jimmy's friend Len once he was discharged from the hospital, and surely one after he was demobilised in May of 1945. They never disclosed to what extent that thought registered with them. Len Howard was so consumed by grief and shame for his role in Jimmy's death, he was never able to face them, even by correspondence. He simply tried to bury the feelings deep within his psyche. Following his return to civilian life, he attempted one menial job after another, but was never able to settle down to anything. Even to visit his parents' home was too much for him, lest by chance he might meet the Richardses while he was there. It took a couple of days to link the theft of a small plane from Swindon Flying Club's hangar with a bizarre plane crash at the abandoned aerodrome at RAF Richford. In the early morning hours of May the 23rd, 1947, the single-engine Tiger Moth had apparently dived, sight unseen, into the southwestern extremity of the concrete runway. The crash had taken place with such force that identification of both plane and pilot took several days. After Len's funeral, his father Peter made contact with the former Wing Commander Dawkins, who told him the full details of what had happened on that May morning 3 years earlier. Only then were the Thomas and Richards families able to piece the story together as they tried to comfort one another in their shared grief.